Oh hey, it's me, Joel Jumpman. I'm just practicing my guitar skills. I hear the ladies love a man who can play the guitar. Only problem is, I need someone to teach me. Luckily I have a solution. I'll just go to the nearest church and ask the worship leader there to teach me. If music's good enough for God, it's gotta be good enough for girls. Instruments are of the devil!
Music. It's been around ever since Iluvatar sang Middle-earth into existence with the Valar in the timeless halls. Wait, sorry, that's Lord of the Rings. I mean, music's been around ever since God spoke the heavens and the earth into existence, and the angels started singing in heaven. Completely different. In the history of the world, music's often been used to worship God, and that music has often been combined with instruments, from bronze instruments in Genesis, to tambourines used after the Exodus, to the time the Ark was brought into Jerusalem and David danced naked.
Let's ignore that last example.
The point is that people have worshipped God with music and instruments for a long time. But after Jesus founded Christianity, while he said to worship God, he kinda left us hanging on what exactly worship is supposed to look like. Former murderer, current saint, Paul, isn't helpful either. He told the Ephesians and Colossians to use psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs in worship. But about instruments, he talks about them as much as Nintendo talks about the 80s Mario movie. To be fair, for most of history, instruments haven't been cheap. Not like they're cheap now, but not many people had them, so most churches in the first few centuries would have sang songs or hymns that we just don't know much about today. Over time, though, worship music evolved. By the 600s, the Gregorian chant got real popular. The Billboard Hot 100 was filled to the brim with them. The organ was introduced to worship sometime around the 10th century. What is an organ? I don't know. I think it's just a piano with extra steps. But with organs or pianos, again, they were expensive, so most churches didn't have any. At least not until the Industrial Revolution. That led to the mass productions of items such as steam engines, Pokemon cards, and instruments. With higher production came instruments that were more easily available to churches. So many churches in the late 1800s, early 1900s got organs or pianos. Unless they believed that those organs were the first step on the road to heck.
Oh, looking at you, Church of Christ.
By around the middle of the 20th century, it was common for many worship services to have a piano, and have the people sing along to the notes and words in the hymn books. That is until the Jesus hippies. In the 1960s, hippies were members of the countercultural movement. Basically, whatever everyone else was doing, they were doing the opposite, and they were fighting the man. And you know how Christians love copying secular culture with movies, video games, etc., and they always feel like 10 years behind? Yeah, the Jesus people were that for hippies. In the 1970s, the Jesus movement revival burst onto the scene, and it led many young hippies to become Christians, and the result was the Christian countercultural movement. But when all these young hippies became Christians, they did give up sex and drugs, but they didn't quite give up rock and roll. They still loved the folk and rock music of the former movement, and so they started writing Christian music in those styles. These young Jesus people started spreading this new hippie-inspired Christian culture. Youth groups and other youth events across the nation started singing contemporary songs and encouraging just terrible hairdos. Sunday mornings, however, were still a time to dress to impress and to sing hymns. But as all the Jesus people grew up, they wanted to keep singing the same Christian hippie songs on Sunday morning. So over time, some churches with younger members started to use this contemporary music. They traded in hymnals with words on large projector screens, pianos with keyboards and electric guitars, and they traded Tuesday night prayer meetings with summoning drums from the ninth layer of heck. Churches that adopted this new style attracted a lot of young people and resulted in a lot of church growth. The problem started when worship leaders at traditional churches were like, the churches with contemporary music are growing exponentially. Time to burn the piano and hymns. While this new music was fine for new churches made mostly of young people, a sudden change in worship style, especially at an older church with more senior congregants, wasn't always received with open arms. What was wrong with the music we always sing? Or, do we need to listen to this devil music? If a worship pastor suddenly changed the style of music, many members would suddenly stop coming. Or they would band together and say, if the music wasn't changed back, they would go start their own church. Thus began the worship wars, the deadliest Christian fight of the century, as long as you don't count the evils of gambling Pokemon cards. Why are these sides so opposed? Well, one argument by the traditionalists is that hymns are a tradition of the church that has been practiced for centuries, ever since the Holy Spirit led Paul to write the lyrics of Amazing Grace while he was imprisoned in Rome. Contemporary music only really uses the songs from the past few decades. If we have 2,000 years of songs, can we really say that today's music is the only music we should be listening to? Another traditional argument is that hymns are more theologically sound than worship songs. This is obvious as they use words like thy, thou, thine, Ebenezer. Those are just holier forms of the words that us heathens normally use. But hymns also go through a more stringent process before being accepted in a hymn book. If it isn't theologically sound, or if it sounds too much like the devil's music, it can be rejected before the book even hits churches. The problem with this argument, though, is that many contemporary worship songs use lyrics straight from the Bible, and many others use the same lyrics as older hymns, just made to be accompanied by a modern band. A contemporary argument is that the church should modernize. Contemporary music helps evoke emotion in the worshippers, mostly because it doesn't sound like the words from a 400-page theology textbook. Shouldn't music that worships God cut to the heart? But these songs are all criticized for being too emotional and repetitive, and it's not like that's the kind of music that God likes. Contemporary advocates will also ask, what's wrong with instruments besides an organ or a piano? Besides the fact that the devil created them. In the Old Testament, God calls people to worship him with timbrels, cymbals, lyres, harps, and other stringed instruments. Why can't we play guitars in our worship, as long as the worship songs are praising God? Now, to be fair, some of the criticism of modern songs is valid. Having a worship leader lead a band can make the worship feel more like AC/DC than a worship of the Holy God. It can start feeling like a concert, and that can conceal the role of the congregation in singing to God. And if we pick what music we sing in worship just based on what we like better, or what will draw more people, aren't we missing the point of worship? Some contemporary songs do have terrible lyrics. Singing, sing a little louder, over and over, that's not really worship. But to be fair, with 2,000 years of hymns, there are some bad lyrics there too. Because both sides have these deeply held beliefs about what is and isn't proper for worship, it caused many churches to split in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. But were the worship walls really as bad as people make them out to be? Were traditionalists ready to smash projectors, and those for contemporary music really ready to burn hymnals?
I know I am.
Honestly, it's not very clear how people felt. I tried to do my own research, but for the first time in my life, the internet has failed me. Okay, make that the second time in my life. The worship walls were mostly before I was born, so I tried to look up a lot of information about it, but most of the articles I found were how to solve the worship walls, or simply said the worship walls happened and were bad. I couldn't find anything about how it went down in particular churches, how they split, or even a ballpark estimate of how many churches split. I suppose I could have asked someone who lived through that time what they experienced and tried to gain that first-hand knowledge of how they viewed that time in the church, but that would mean leaving my room and actually talking to people. What do I look like, an extrovert? Now, I did find a 2002 article from the Bonner Group, and it said that only 1% of churches were experiencing severe worship tension. Most people in churches don't care about what style of music is being played, or what instruments are used. The worship walls were, and are, mostly overblown. People are more likely to change churches if the preaching changes. If the worship changes, many will stay anyways. Despite it being overblown, the worship walls still brings up plenty of good questions. Do we need guitars and drums in worship services? Is using contemporary worship making us too much like the culture? Should we go back to hymns, or maybe a blended style? Is worship becoming entertainment instead of praising God? And is someone going to explain to me why we put drummers in cages? While we should critically engage the content and purpose of worship, we should recognize that any instrument or musical style can glorify God. Just because it's newer or older doesn't necessarily make it better or worse. It just makes it different.
Maybe instruments aren't the devil. Maybe God doesn't care exactly how we worship him, as long as we do so in spirit and in truth. I just wish someone would have told me that before I started burning everything. This didn't go down as well as I had hoped. But on the bright side, at least I got a hot date.